Going on? Sorry, my hair looks crazy, but I just wanted to do like a quick reaction to, I forgot what her name was, no, something Applebaum, and she wrote a book. She's a writer for The Atlantic, and it's called Autocracy Inc. Autocracy Inc. And the central thesis and topic that's explored is how authoritarian regimes are working more closely together. And so I just wanted to offer like a sort of simple depiction, which is probably partially encapsulates this. And trying to stay objective, I think the lines of globalization is like an obvious starting point, even if it's not always the most fundamental starting point. And that's one of the issues. Um, that's always one of the challenges when you adopt such like a sweeping topic like this, um, which I don't think anyone needs to say, but um, the sort of analogy is at least partially, if you're from the West and you look at this, it's sort of like a buoy, right? Sort of like a buoy in the sense that you understand that there's this thing that keeps bobbing in and out of your sort of sphere of influence. And when you think of layers of understanding and globalized forces, it appears there's always these tensions that are being pushed into your world, even if they're not the most strategic thing in the moment. If there's something that needs to be understood or responded to, or you need to find a new semblance of balance with it, then that's one way of doing it. The other sort of view is adopting what a lot of what we would call authoritarian regimes in the West, um, adopting the narrative that because it sits right again, the narrative itself also sits in this layer where it's really tough to get foundational and fundamental with some of this stuff. And that narrative is that these are governments and societies. These are aspects of human civilization, or if you adopt like Huntington or something, um, they're a civilization that performs differently or is performing a different task within the same connected system, and that's a task of pushing something up a hill essentially. And so when we and so like the moving picture from the other side of the aisle is that yeah, we're all right next to each other, we're all pushing something, and if something gets in front of you or whatever, well, you know who this guy is that's doing this, right? You know how this society works, is that thing's going up the hill like one way or another. There's not really optionality in a strict sense there. And so if you want to complain about a foot or an arm overstretching, well, it's not a buoy. It's not something that we're like trying to push on you or you're trying to keep out. It's just that we're going to, at some point, interact with one another in this way that appears aggressive and intrusive. Aggressive and intrusive. And so, is this reconcilable? If we adopt this sort of way of looking at it, is this reconcilable with what Applebaum basically concludes and is forced to argue, forced to describe to us that the level of sophistication and the level of coordination are both increasing. So when you think of how someone might come to like an integrative problem, you're aligning interests and you're able to move together. It's more complex, or there's more sophistication, and it's more collaborative, or whatever the word was. Um, so is that reconcilable? And again, I think if you believe and adopt one of these narratives, the idea is eventually that narrative has to grasp on something and pick it up. Um, and if you want to keep it on the level of like values and ideology, it's easy enough to say this is just how the world works, right? This is just how society functions, or something. People are generally okay with stronger forms of governments. They're okay with stronger decision powers within institutions. And if you ask Russia and Vladimir Putin, he'll say they're also glad to see when those institutions, uh, in different ways, punch back within the society itself. These are social political issues, socio-economic political issues that governments manage. Now, if you're in the West, you can never really buy that, right? The U.S. I'll put on my if I put on my U.S. hat, my gear, real quick. Um, you can see that there's always going to be a subset, and what's likely to be a growing subset Like, and this is maybe like a really optimistic reading from the U.S. perspective, that like the worst, the sort of the worst this can ever get is that at some point these democratic values of choice, autonomy, personal sovereignty, all the like, these non-anarchic ideas about having representation in the system. Um, those ideas and those things are always going to, at some point, sort of pop over the crescent, right? Those are the things that are planted in the ground and that are going to come up at some point. You have to harvest them one way or another. You can't avoid them. And the other sort of option, the more pessimistic reading of this sort of notion that we're all pushing together different parts, different layers, where their sharing lanes are the thing itself, is that um, well, at the end of the day, people are going to get tired, and when you see that you're behind or something, those are pressures that are going to be exerted against the West. And for some reason that maybe goes beyond realism, it goes beyond principle, beyond reason, goes beyond anything that we can reconcile, and we'll tell you why that makes sense in a little bit. But that pressure comes out at the West, and it's not a pressure valve. It's something else, right? This is just, basically another strategy to deal with a failing problem, right? And so, in one sense, you can always manage values because values in a society and civilization are more complex. And if you ask most people at most times in most ways, you know, the cultural context is that people are unhappy with their government in the same ways that people in the U.S. are unhappy with Trump, and that's that's true or not, and it's true or not true at various times. I said Trump, but general American politics, bipartisanism, bicameral legislation, two-party system, all the political science words, Um, but yeah, the but yeah, and so I think it's interesting because there's people who would want to better understand how these things work, and you know, I think the conclusion is that like a forward-looking view, and also a pessimistic view, is that we have to better understand the thing that we're doing together separately, and we have to better understand either the mechanisms or the underlying cause and description that we can agree on and that we can work on together. Um, and like this implies that things like sophistication um, and uh, coordination aren't intrinsically bad, right? And I don't know if that was in the book or anything, but those things aren't intrinsically bad. Um, they're also when you just leave those things like that, they imply this level of risk that's going to escalate, which is a different issue, right? It's implying that there are leading indicators which would suggest that an actor like the United States or someone else should introduce aggression earlier and at different times, and they should introduce aggression that is less likely to be understood and produces a less than capable response, right? So it implies that you should strategically respond before the fact, preemptively. Um, yeah, and back to the level of like ideology and all this other stuff, right? Um, you know, I think people get back to this point of like well, we're all reading the tea leaves, right? This is the NBA, whatever you want to say. This is the FIFA World Cup or whatever. Um, we're all in this thing together now, and it's like, okay, well that's partially true, but again, when the sort of rules change and whatever, maybe this is like an argument against polarity or something, which is interesting as well. It's sort of, I think, intrinsically undermining that concept. So that's it. That's the video.